Now, to work towards this expense tracker, let's again think about the kind of components we got there. And you might remember that in the end, we were able to split up this simple looking application into a bunch of components. In the chart, we had the individual chart bars, we had the individual expense items, we had the form for adding a new expense, and therefore we get a bunch of components and a bunch of components we could get started with. Now, why don't we get started with the expense item though? So this row where we have the title and the amount and the date of an expense. And therefore we now want to build our first own component. Now we could add it here in app.js, but it is considered a good and best practice to actually put new components into new files so that you have one file per component. And that will mean that in React projects, you will end up with dozens or hundreds of files, because in React projects, you'll have dozens or hundreds of components in the end. And that's absolutely normal. Now, to organize our source code a little bit, here in the source folder, I'll add a components folder, which will hold all these component source files. Now, I will not move app.js in there because this app component will be a special kind of component. Not regarding its code, that will be the same code as you see it in all the other components, but regarding its role in the application. It will be our so-called root component, which means it's the main component being rendered here in our starting file in index.js. And all other components will be either nested inside of app.js or nested inside of other components, which then in turn again are nested somewhere else. Because ultimately with React, we build a component tree, you could say. You have this main app component at the top, and then below that you could have any other kinds of custom HTML elements, so other kinds of components, which in the end hold other pieces of the user interface. And big applications, therefore, of course, can result in quite big component trees, where only the topmost component is rendered directly into the HTML page with help of that React DOM render instruction. All the other components will not be rendered with this instruction, but instead will be used as regular HTML elements inside of our HTML code, inside of our components. But you'll see that all in action in a second. So inside of the components folder, I'll add a new file, and I'm using shortcuts here. You can also use these buttons, of course, for adding folders and files. And I'll add a new file here, which I will name expense_item.js, because this will hold my expense item component. Now, one word about the file name. Here again, you are generally free to name this however you want, but it's a common convention in React applications to name it like this, starting with a capital character, one word, where if you combine multiple words in one word, every sub-word, so to say, starts with a new capital character, like the I here in item. And then inside of this component, if the file is named like this, you of course should have a component that is dealing with rendering expense item data, so that the file name tells us which kind of logic and HTML code will live inside of that file. So now let's write the concrete component code in that new file. And of course, that means that we now finally have to understand what component code is. How is a component written in React? Well, we already saw it in app.js. It's just a function. And that is a key takeaway. That is super important. Definitely keep that in mind. A component in React is just a JavaScript function. A special kind of function, special regarding what it returns, that it does return this JSX code. But other than that, it's just a JavaScript function. Therefore, if we want to create an expense item component here, we add the function keyword, give it any name of our choice, though again, the convention is to repeat the file name here, just without the extension, so expense item. And then in here, we return the HTML code, the JSX code, which should be brought onto the screen by this component. So for the moment, I'll add a h2 tag here and say expense item in there. Now that's our first very basic custom-made component. And of course, it's quite similar to the app component, which I gave to you, because in the end, all components are similar. Components are just functions which then return HTML code. And of course, the HTML code you do return in a component depends on what that component should render on the screen. Of course, that's not our final HTML code for this kind of component. Now, to use this component, we need to export it. Otherwise, it's only usable inside of that file, and that's not helpful to us. So we add an export statement, which in JavaScript simply looks like this. We export this function as the default for this file. Now we can import it in another file. And as I mentioned, we're not going to import it in index.js, and we're not going to render it like this because we only do this once for our root component. Instead, I now want to use my custom component here like a regular HTML element, so like a h2 element, inside of the HTML code written in the app component here. Hence, at the top of the app.js file, we should now import our custom component. So we simply import expense item from /components. We need to go into this components folder because that's where the file lives, /expense item, and then without the extension. This path in the end tells JavaScript that we're looking for an expense item file in a components folder which sits next to this app.js file in which we have this import statement. Now that this is imported, the cool thing is that we can just use this like a HTML element. So we can, for example, replace this paragraph with expense item, like this, opening and closing, written like this. The key difference to the built-in HTML elements just is that it's not starting with a lowercase character, but with an uppercase character. And indeed, your own custom components must start with an uppercase character when you're using them in JSX code like this, so that React is able to detect that this is a custom component. Because the simple rule which React applies is that lowercase elements are built-in HTML elements, so it will look for them as built-in elements, whereas elements starting with an uppercase character are elements defined by you or some other developer. So this is a custom-made component, and we have to use the name which we used here in the import as a name here, because that's how this connection is established. This tells React that we want to use this component which is imported under this name from the expense item file. If we now save everything, all the files, and we go back to the browser, we see expense item showing up here, which of course is the h2 tag rendered by our own custom component, because we now created and imported and used this custom component. And it's always these steps. You create a component, which is in the end just a function returning some HTML code. You then export it, and then ultimately you import it in the file where you want to use it, so that there in the JSX code you can use it like a HTML element, just starting with this uppercase character.